Section 2 of Notes of a Native Son. So, what happened after the incident in New Jersey is James Baldwin returns to Harlem in sometime in the second week of June 1943, because there are two things that are about to happen. One is his father is about to die, and his mother is ready for her confinement for the birth of the next child. So both these events, as you already know, happen on the same day. And James Baldwin then goes on to talk about his mother's continuous miscalculation, because the child, the last sibling of James Baldwin, did not arrive at the expected time. It seemed to the others as if the child was not willing to come out of the safe womb, mother's womb, where she was safe and well cared for and free from racial inequality and all the troubles of the world. And on the other side, James Baldwin's father, he had been striving for death throughout his life, but at this point of time when death was waiting for him, he was not willing to die. Life and death coexisting together in the same house. So that is what he describes in the beginning of the next section. And then he goes on to the next section where he provides us with a larger canvas. In the first paragraph, he was talking about what was happening inside his family. And then he goes on to talk about what was happening in Harlem in general during that particular tense time. It seemed as if everybody was waiting for something to happen. And everything was actually very calm on the surface. Violently still. That is the phrase that he uses to describe the situation in Harlem at that point of time. Racial tensions throughout this country were exacerbated during the early years of the war. So, this was pre-Second World War, and during this period, there was massive recruitment of Negro soldiers into the United States Army. And there was a great expansion in the labor market. So, people from all over the country, they were coming to New York, and all these things were happening together. Racial tensions were simmering. They were at a very high point. And Negro soldiers, irrespective of whichever part of America they came from, all the military training centers were located in the South. And the South had a very prejudiced attitude towards the Negroes, towards the African Americans. So all these Negro soldiers, all these African American soldiers, they were getting their training in training centers which were located in the South, and all of them used to write letters to their families, and these letters revealed the bitter racial inequality, the racial segregation, the discrimination that they encountered in these places. So in the defense plants, in the army camps, the racial segregation, the discrimination that was faced by these soldiers, that was known to their family members, that was known to the larger African American community, and it affected the temperament, the attitude, the spirit of the people living in Harlem. So there was this situation in Harlem which was really bad, and everybody talked about it, everybody knew, everybody discussed what to do about it. Clergymen, policemen, educators, politicians, social workers. In one breath, they used to say that there is no crime wave in Harlem. But the next moment, they would talk about how to fight this crime wave, how to solve this situation. And their solution was that to have more playgrounds. So when the young people, they went to the playgrounds, they played in the playgrounds, all this excess energy, all this excessive physical energy, this mental tension, it would be let out on the playgrounds. But then Baldwin tells us that even the playgrounds were places where there was racial tension, where there used to be these racial fights between both blacks and whites. So the crime was increasing in Harlem. And this crime was because of the letters that were coming in from the various army camps which were located in the southern part of the United States, where the black or African American soldiers were encountering a lot of racial discrimination. And another thing that was happening was the strength of the police force was gradually being increased, especially in Harlem. There were a number of stabbings, shootings, gang warfare, assaults. But one thing that caught everyone's attention was this incident where 6 Negro girls, they attacked a white girl because the white girl was being very arrogant with them. She was stepping on their toes, as whites were doing across America. So that was one interesting event that was reported in all newspapers, and everybody talked about it endlessly. Then in the next paragraph, he talks about the overwhelming, dominating presence of policemen all over. Policemen on foot, policemen on horseback, and everywhere, always 2 by 2. Okay, there was this overwhelming presence of policemen all over Harlem. Another thing that he noticed was that there were these diverse groups of people who were sitting on the doorsteps of their houses or common areas or public places, and they were all talking. It was not the usual normal conversation where people used to pass comments on passers-by, where people used to laugh and joke together. All these conversations that were taking place in Harlem at this point of time were very, very intense, and diverse groups of people stood together and talked. And that means usually what you would see was there would be a group of young men, very street smart, dressed very nicely, passing comments on girls who were passing by. But that had stopped. Now people were talking about something else. They were talking about the situation in Harlem. They were talking about racial segregation, racial inequality. And these groups comprised of church women, churchly matrons, very respectable churchly matrons, no nonsense older men who used to discuss baseball, and women in their life, but they were also part of this group. Young men, then there was the what he calls the race men, the people who were very concerned about bringing back or restoring, or not even restoring is a wrong word, of sort of establishing racial equality. And they got these letters from their friends in the army. So naturally, the whole of Harlem was boiling. It was simmering in a state of racial tension. And people, the African Americans, they were standing in groups, diverse groups, and all of them were talking about this racial discrimination. They were sort of waiting for something to happen, all this tension to sort of burst, and it would all go out of control. So Baldwin here talks about Seventh-day Adventists, Methodists, Spiritualists, and Holy Rollers. Holy Rollers are church members who sing and dance along with the prayers. So everybody of different denominations, they were all standing together and talking about the racial tension which was existent at that time in Harlem. And then he, in the next paragraph, he talks about the indignities, the dangers which were suffered by Negro army men in uniform. And this made their families back home very, very uneasy. Everybody was concerned about what is happening to their boys who have joined the army and are being trained in military centers in the southern part of the United States. It was perhaps like feeling that the most dangerous part of a dangerous journey had been passed, and that now, even if death should come, it would come with honor and without the complicity of their countrymen. See, in this paragraph, what he says is that all these army men of various colors, they were fighting for a common cause. They were fighting against a common enemy. We are talking about the Second World War here. And all of them should have actually been united by this feeling of fervent patriotism, which Baldwin says actually did not exist. The African American soldiers, they joined the army, and they were actually taking up the burden of suffering segregation, racial discrimination, along with fighting against an enemy. So they were fighting on two fronts. They were fighting against their white counterparts, in America, white American counterparts, and if they had to go overseas and participate in the battle that was taking place in Europe, then they were facing death also. So the attitude of the Negro soldiers or the African American soldiers was like, we are going to fight for this country, whether you like us or not, whether you appreciate what we are doing or not, that is okay. We are going there, we are going to fight against the common enemy. Okay. And on the 28th of July, which Baldwin says was a Wednesday, he visited his father for the first time. His father had been confined to an asylum, and he goes there with his aunt to meet his father. Till now, he had not wanted to meet his father. He had resisted meeting his father, but he went to meet his father and with his aunt, and it was a very difficult journey because he tells us about his aunt. They were traveling to Long Island, this particular asylum where his father had been confined. It was in Long Island, and the journey was very difficult. It was very hot and dusty, and throughout the journey his aunt was very, very disturbed. She was going to meet her brother who was about to die. And then Baldwin tells us that he had not wanted to meet his father when his father was dying, because he had not wanted to look upon his father as a ruin. His father had been a very powerful, very dominating character when he was strong and healthy. Now that very strong, very powerful, very healthy man was on his deathbed, and it had been easier for Baldwin to hate him when he was strong, but now he had become a ruin. He was sort of waiting for death to take him, and when you stop hating, what is left is pain, and Baldwin didn't want to confront that kind of pain. Then he talks about his aunt. His aunt was very disturbed because she was going to meet her brother who was about to die. When they had been young, when the children had been young, and when the aunt had been young, Baldwin says she was a very beautiful woman, and she used to have some or the other little treat inside her handbag which she would give to all these children. So her arrival was something that the children looked forward to. They loved having their aunt coming over, but all that had changed. And now she had become just another old woman. There was nothing more to expect from her. And what Baldwin felt was pity and guilt and fear when he looked at his aunt. So when they entered the room in which Baldwin's father was lying, she started crying. Baldwin's aunt, she started crying, and Baldwin says that his father looked like a shriveled up little black monkey, and he could not even move because there was all this big equipment that was connected to his body. There were tubes which were entering into his arm, and Baldwin gets the image of Gulliver being tied down by the pygmies when he looks at his father. So Baldwin looks at his father, and his aunt is weeping all the while, and there is a whistling sound that is coming from his father's throat. He could not speak, and Baldwin wanted to take his hand to say something, but he didn't know what he could have said, so he keeps quiet, and the only sound that they could hear was the whistling that was coming from his father's throat. So the doctor came back, and both aunt and nephew, they leave the room and they get back on the train, and it was again a very difficult journey. The next morning they get a telegram from the hospital informing them that James Baldwin's father has died. He has passed away. Suddenly what happens, as is usual, the whole house is filled with relatives and family and friends, and in the meantime his mother had been confined for the delivery of the 9th child, and so the whole house was in chaos and confusion. There was a body that was waiting to be buried, and section 3 begins by talking about Baldwin telling us that he had nothing black to wear. It was his father's funeral and he had nothing black to wear. And that was a nagging problem that kept on worrying him. It was also his birthday. So usually when we have larger issues to think about and we don't have a solution for that, and we are confronting pain or sorrow, what we do is we focus on the smaller things, unimportant things. So he was confronted by the fact that his father was no longer there. His father was dead. And instead of confronting that pain of his father's loss, of his father's absence from his life, he focused on not having black clothes to wear for the funeral. So his birthday was competing against his father's funeral. Anyway, he had met a girl earlier, and this girl, she was actually waiting to be taken out that night. She probably had plans that he would treat her to a big dinner and that they would go dancing to a nightclub later on. But sometime during the course of events, they decided that they would go anyway, and they would go after his father's funeral got over. So as the funeral time approached, he didn't know what to do with himself, how to handle himself. But this girl was very, very resourceful. Somehow or the other, she managed to get a black shirt for him, and she ironed it, and he dressed in the darkest pants and the jacket, and he was slightly drunk, and he went for his father's funeral. When he came to the chapel, what he found was the chapel was not packed, but it was very quiet, and he saw his father's relatives, he saw his siblings, whom he refers to as his children, and he saw a lot of people whom he had not seen during his childhood. And the chief mourner was, of course, his aunt. His mother was in hospital, and his aunt and his father had always had long arguments when they were young, but she was crying very badly, and that sort of showed the depth of the affection that the brother and sister had for each other. So he says she was one of the few people in the world who had, and their incessant quarreling proved precisely the strength of the tie that bound them. The only other person in the world whose relationship to my father rivaled my aunt's in depth was my mother, who was not there because she was in hospital having her last child. Baldwin says that it was probably a very long funeral. Actually, it was a very short funeral, and there were no expressions of grief. But then the funeral was sort of curated by a minister who was one of the few people with whom Baldwin's father continued to have a good relationship until the end of his life. As we discussed earlier, as I told you earlier, he was not a very popular man, but this preacher had somehow managed to have a okay relationship with Baldwin's father, and he was the one who was preaching the sermon at the funeral. And the picture that is presented by this preacher about David Baldwin is very different from the picture that the family had. This preacher portrayed Baldwin's father as a very thoughtful, patient, forbearing, Christian human being who was very kind, who was a model for his children. And everybody who was gathered there, they also had this feeling that when we die, there should be a preacher like this who talks only good things about us, who says only good things about us. So when the preacher was saying all this, his James Baldwin's aunt, she was mourning, she was crying, she was grief stricken. And there is a contrast between the image of the man as Baldwin and his siblings knew him and the image that was portrayed by the preacher. What emerges here is that Baldwin thought of his father as a man who was deeply concerned about his children, and he was somebody who behaved very rudely with his children. He was somebody who kept on warning his children to keep away from white people, to keep away from the neighbors. but he was also probably a very kind man who did not know how to emote, who did not know how to express the fear, the worry, the anxiety, the tension that he was carrying within himself. Because these are unique tensions, these are unique concerns, these are unique anxieties that only a black parent would feel for their black children, because you are bringing up children in a very hostile situation, something that would probably be identified by people who understand the problems created by the caste system that we have in India. So there is this passage here where Baldwin expresses the concern that his father might have experienced. How to prepare the child for the day when the child would be despised, and how to create in the child, by what means, a stronger antidote to this poison than one had found for oneself. He's talking about the poison of racial inequality, which was prevalent in America at that point of time. So how do you bring up a child in such a hostile environment, where the child is going to face a lot of problems because of the child's color, because of the child's race? So when the child walks out of the home, the child is going into a situation which is fraught with worry, which is fraught with tension, which is fraught with a lot of repression and a lot of violence. So how do you tell your child that you should not let this hatred, this bitterness get into your system? This is the medicine, this is the solution that I have for you, so that you can overcome all this anger, this anguish that you have towards this hostile situation that you are put in. There is no antidote. So this is a concern that all these African American parents might have encountered. And that is something that James Baldwin understands when he attends his father's funeral in that quiet church. So all these burdens are there in every African American parent's mind. So in the next section, he says that the preacher kept on talking, and he watched his siblings, his father's children. He had taken care of his siblings for a long time. He had changed their diapers, he had given them baths, he had slapped them, he had taken them to school, he had scolded them, and he had loved them. He loved them deeply. And all these things, they go through his mind. He then thinks about the affection that his father had for him. Once upon a time, long ago, his father had been very proud of him. His father had been very proud of his voice. His father had loved to show off his son to the people, to his people. I had a voice, and my father had liked to show me off before the members of the church. I had forgotten what he had looked like when he was pleased. But now I remembered that he had always been grinning with pleasure when my solos ended. It is now, when he is sitting in the church, attending his father's funeral, that he recollects those precious memories when he and his father had an uncomplicated, affectionate relationship, when they had loved each other, when they had sustained each other. And he comes to the conclusion that his father had not always been a cruel man. Life, situation had made his father a cruel, bitter man. Then he remembers the fights that they used to have, the terrible fights that they used to have. And those fights were very, very bad. They were the worst kind of fights. And then he recollects one important incident, probably the only time when he and his father had been completely on the same wavelength. They had understood each other completely. His father had asked him while they were walking together, when this was in later years, that was when James Baldwin was a teenager and he had started preaching in the church. So his father asked him, "You'd rather write than preach, wouldn't you?" And James Baldwin was astonished that his father had been able to understand him completely at that point of time. So going on to the next section. So the casket, the coffin was opened, so all the mourners could come and look at the face of the dead person, and everybody was led to the casket to look on the face of the dead father. And James Baldwin clearly did not like the idea of small children being exposed to death, but then all these children, they were led one by one, including James Baldwin. He was also led to the casket, and he was shown the face of his father. And he says, children are very, very vulnerable at this point of time, because they don't know how to handle such a situation where they are looking at the face of someone who was a very dominating presence in their life, their father, somebody whom they were not comfortable with, but now he has gone. He is gone to God, as was explained to them by everybody around them. Anyway, when Baldwin looks at the face of his father, he says he was simply an old man, dead. And it was hard to believe that he had ever given anyone either joy or pain. But his life filled that room, life and death coexisting together. Okay, so after that, what happened? After the funeral, he was celebrating his birthday, and something happened in the lobby of Hotel Braddock. What happened was, there was an argument between a Negro soldier and a white policeman over a Negro girl. So soon what happened? See, it's a very terrible mix, you know. There is this African American soldier, there is a white policeman, and there is a African American girl. And the situation soon exploded out of control. A lot of rumors started spreading, and the soldier died. The African American soldier died. Immediately, rumors started floating in the street that the African American soldier had been shot at the back of his head, and he had died while he was protecting a African American woman. The facts were actually very different, but who bothers about facts in such a situation, you know? Everybody was feeling this anger. There was simmering racial tension, and there was so much anger, hostility against the whites. So they listened to the story that they wanted to listen to. Nobody cared about the facts. Nobody cared about the truth, and the whole situation exploded out of control. Soon what happened? The mobs started coming out of the ghettos, the some areas where they were concentrated, and they started attacking everything that they saw in the neighborhood. And they were looking for symbols of white power. What did they do? They attacked all the white business establishments in Harlem. The thing is, most of these establishments were closed because it was night time. Otherwise, it could have been a bloody riot. Only the shops, the establishments were destroyed. There was large-scale looting. Bars, stores, pawn shops, restaurants, little cafes, everything was looted. Everything was destroyed. And food, coffee cans, everything was strewn on the streets. And Harlem sort of exploded out of control from the events that happened at Hotel Braddock. See, everybody knows that this kind of violence, mob violence, doesn't do any good. But it was sort of venting out their anger, venting out their frustration, venting out their bitterness, venting out their feelings of anger against a repressive system which believed that they were inferior because of their race, because of their color. Then James Baldwin tells us that usually what happened in Harlem, in the ghettos of Harlem, was that these people used to beat up each other. But now it had spilled out of Harlem, and they wanted to attack everything that was a symbol of white power. And then Baldwin tries to find out the real relationship between the African Americans and the white American. And he says that it is not pure hatred. It is not just a feeling of pure hatred. That doesn't mean that they loved each other. What he's trying to say is that the whites were very, very powerful. The whites were taking the blacks for granted. Okay, the last paragraph is quite long, and here it begins by Baldwin saying that to smash something is the ghetto's chronic need. Most of the time, it is the members of the ghetto who smash each other and themselves. But as long as the ghetto walls are standing, there will always come a moment when the outlets do not work. James Baldwin says that it is the perpetual necessity of Harlem, the people of Harlem, to smash something, because they face so much hostility when they go into the white man's world. So when you carry so much frustration, so much repressed emotion within you, you have to vent it somewhere. And where do you vent it? You vent it within your community. But that particular day, after the events which had happened in Hotel Braddock, it was impossible to keep it confined to Harlem. That is why it broke out of the African American quarter, and all the white establishments were attacked. Everything was looted and destroyed. And then he tries to understand the real relationship between the African Americans and the white American. And he says that this relationship, this very complex relationship that exists between the African American or black or Negro people and the white Americans, it is something that cannot promote pure hatred, because it's a very complex relationship that they have. They are mutually dependent on each other. Both communities are mutually dependent on each other. And another thing is, the white Americans are very, very powerful. They take the African Americans for granted, and they sort of treat them very complacently. They humiliate them. But it is very difficult for the African Americans to maintain the stance of pure hatred towards the white Americans, because they have to coexist. They have to live together in that land. They have to adapt, adjust, and they have to make reasonably wise decisions in order to live together in America, because there is no other place for them to go. They have to be there. They have to live there. So you might feel terrible anger, terrible rage against someone or people belonging to a particular community, and at the same time you need them also for your survival. So it's a very complex situation. You cannot completely alienate them, because you need them for your survival. You need them to be there for you. They also need you in the same way, irrespective of the fact that they treat you very badly, they are very arrogant and they humiliate you. So that is the complex relationship that Baldwin is trying to explain, which existed between the African Americans and the white Americans. And then he gives an example. He talks about amputation and gangrene. Amputation is swift. You just chop off the diseased part of the body. You chop it off, you cut it off. And the other thing is gangrene. Gangrene is something that spreads very slowly. Gangrene usually affects people who spend a lot of time in cold climate, extremely cold climate. Gangrene gradually spreads and it rots that particular part of the body, and the poison spreads throughout the body. So these are two ways. One is amputation, one is gangrene. So when you cut off a part of your body, you are going through life like a cripple. And that is what he is saying. You cannot cut off your relation with the whites. You cannot be there without them. Okay. And the other part is also equally bad. Having them in your life is also equally bad. It is something that can create a lot of pain. It is something that can create a lot of agony in your mind. And there are choices, but it is also a very troublesome choice. What to do in such a complex situation? There are no clear-cut solutions. There are no simple solutions for such a complex problem, for such a complex situation that exists in America even today. Then in the next paragraph, he talks about the legacy that every generation of African Americans has passed on to the next generation. Nobody can escape this. It is an inevitable truth of their lives. That bitterness is foolish, but you cannot escape from that bitterness because you are living in such a situation. That bitterness will be a part of you. When you are encountering people who are casually racist towards you, you will naturally develop a hostile attitude towards them. You will naturally feel this bitterness, and you cannot take it out of your system because every single day more bitterness is being added to it, more hostility, more frustration, more repression is being added to it. Casual racism, everyday racism. So he is saying that we have to hold on to things that actually matter despite all the problems that we face, despite the hostility, despite the repression, despite the discrimination that we encounter, despite the casual daily racism that we encounter in our daily life. We have to hold on to things that matter. And what matters to James Baldwin? He tells us that he must think about the dead man, that is his father. The dead man was important. His father was somebody important. New life is also important. His sibling who is in hospital, who has just been delivered by his mother, that sibling is also important. Blackness and whiteness, the color of the skin, the race, that does not matter. But what we must accept is to believe that they did was to acquiesce in one's own destruction. When you say that the color of your skin, that your race is important, then what you are doing is you are destroying yourself. You should go beyond that. You should grow beyond that. And hatred is something that has the capacity to destroy the person who is nurturing it, who is nursing it. So he is telling us that hatred is not a solution for such a complex situation. We have to look at things that matter. We have to consider those things as being very, very important, as being precious, despite the problems that we face from the white world. And he says that these two ideas are always there in his mind, and there is this conflict. The first one was that of acceptance, that you accept life as it is without any complaints, without any bitterness. Take life as it is, which is quite difficult because we all tend to react, to respond to our situation. And just admit that injustice is common. Life is not fair. Nobody said that life is going to be fair. You accept it and you move on with it. But that doesn't mean that you become complacent, that you let other people be hostile to you, let other people discriminate against you. That is one idea, acceptance. And the second idea that he talks about is of equal power, that one must never in one's own life accept these injustices as commonplace, but must fight them with all one's strength. The second idea is equal power. You should never accept that the discriminatory treatment that is being given to you because of your color, because of your race, is something that is common. It is something that is normal. Don't accept it as normal. You must fight against it using all your strength. This fight begins in the heart, he says. And he says that I have to keep my heart free from hatred and despair. No matter what I face in the outside world, I have to keep on fighting in my mind against hatred and despair. I have to keep it away from my soul. And when so Baldwin says, when I thought about this is a realization that I had, that I have to keep on fighting against hatred and despair. My heart became heavier. I felt sort of burdened. I felt sort of like I'm under pressure. And I also realized that now I can never get back my father. I can never get him back. I can never talk to him again. And I wished, he says, I wish that he had been beside me so that I could have searched his face for the answers which only the future would give me now. He says, I yearned for my dead father to be with me so that I could look at his face and get the answers to the questions that are pouring into my mind. How do you confront such a difficult situation? What is the attitude that you develop in order to encounter this complex situation? Only the future will give me the answers. With that, I conclude my explanation of this essay, Notes of a Native Son. I hope this will help you. Thank you.